If you think about what Hart achieved in his best work, it's not merely the artistic excellence that one admires, it is the singularity and courage of what he did.
He wanted art to have something divine about it. He was passionate about what he considered the mission of art. And he was passionate about Lindy.
We wish that he would have had a longer life. He was taken from us too soon, and yet what a legacy this man was able to leave to the world.
The great focus of, really, in my view, of all great art has almost always been the human form, because the human form is the way of expressing the experience of being human. And it's been the focus of art history from the beginning, whether you're talking about the ancient carvings of woman that you find, prehistoric carvings, all through the great ages of art. It's always the human figure that has drawn the most attention.
Well, I think that almost by definition that the human form, especially the naked human form, has to be central to sculpture. It doesn't mean it's the only thing you can do, but if you think about this, it is the one unbroken continuity from the earliest pieces of sculpture we have, even the Venus of Willendorf, these depictions in a sense of the human form to express some larger human concern. So I think that that's one of the things that really makes Hart's work powerful, is that he put himself right in the middle of a tradition that has been going on not simply as long as history, but all the way back into prehistory.
The west facade of the Washington National Cathedral is a gigantic piece of high relief sculpture. The idea of the swirling chaos that presumably preceded human life is captured so dramatically. It was a kind of brilliant dramatization because it had motion that is so rare.
Now with Rick Hart, with his male and female torso, which are as fine as any classical sculptures of the human figure have ever been, you're looking at a beautifully formed human being that's telling a story just in their posture or their movement.
Everything that we've lost in the postmodern era, the last 50 years, he is trying to restore. He was very aware of what he was doing. Rick is opening the door, so to speak, of a new way of seeing art, of a new purpose in art, a new civic spirit in art, a new sense of beauty in art, a new spiritual quality in art.
And I think that one of the things that Hart does, and rather masterfully in terms of the religious art that he did, is he reconnects with the junction of kind of eros and logos, of the sacred and the profane, sort of just Christ's body crucified on the cross. I mean, it has the ecstatic eroticism that the Baroque Italian artists brought to religious art. In no ways is it disrespectful of religion, but it gives you the energy of incarnation, and that's when I think Hart is most powerful.
His figures are heroic and romantic. The figure of Adam alone is probably the single greatest piece of figurative sculpture in American 20th century art, going back to Daniel Chester French's Lincoln. In retrospect, 100 years from now, it may be more important.
I mean, you have to go back to things like the Lincoln Memorial to find something that's truly a successful work of art as well as a successful public monument. Frederick Hart had a particular genius for this sort of thing. He could do a monument or a portrait that was true to both the artistic occasion and the public occasion.
And I've always been attracted to that importance of sculpture. That's why sculpture has an importance beyond the usual, if you will, importance of art. And I've always found that fascinating in a kind of a Jungian way, that communities very much need sculpture. Visual symbols of their creed and their culture. My first recollection of an artistic experience was being spanked by my mother at the age of 6 or 7 for drawing a naked lady. I don't know if you're going to need that, but it's the truth.
As a dealer, one of the things that you always are looking for is this, the thrill of the hunt, the sense of discovery. And I had been on a hunt in Paris for a group of 19th century prints and drawings for an exhibition that we were organizing. And on my way back on the plane, there was a copy that someone had left of an art journal. I flipped through the magazine and it fell open to a double-page spread of a picture of these figures, struggling, emerging. I don't know. I didn't know what. I didn't know the artist. I didn't know the work. But it turns out that was my first exposure to Frederick Hart's work, and I could not believe the sense of life force that was emanating from that page. I knew it was a photograph. I knew it was just 2 dimensions I was working at, but I had a visceral response to it. The next morning, I called information, and in Washington, D.C., I said, "Do you have a listing for Frederick Hart?" I remember kind of introducing myself and saying, "I saw this story about your work, and I have no idea where this might lead, but I was so moved by what I saw that I would love to shake the hand that shaped that sculpture." When I came to see him, the clay that I had seen the picture of was there in the studio. And as powerful as it was on the photograph, nothing really prepared me for the impact of actually seeing the clay study that he was working on for the National Cathedral. I think back with Picasso and Kahnweiler, the length of their association, or Leo Castelli with Jasper Johns, and that meeting was the start of something that went from that day through the end of Frederick Hart's life. It actually continues on now. His wife Lindy and I still work together.
Even I knew he was affectionately known as the mayor of DuPont because he had lived there for so long. He'd been in that area since he was about 17, I guess, and lived above Schwartz's drugstore with a lot of other artists and writers. Rick was always on the prowl for models. So he found out that he knew the fellow that I was sort of dating at the time. So he asked him if I would model for him, or he may have asked him if it was okay if he asked me if he would model for me. And this person said, "Sure."
I had seen Lindy. She was the girlfriend of a friend of mine, and had seen her a couple of times over the years. He sort of seemed to keep her in hiding. And she was a very striking lady. And I'm always looking for models, really interesting, beautiful models. And I asked him if he would mind if I asked her to model for the tympanum, the cathedral tympanum. And he said no, he didn't mind at all. Go ahead and ask her. And that was the beginning of the end for his relationship to her.
So he introduced himself and asked me to model, and I said no. Because I just wasn't sure about that. Plus I had a job, and I wasn't a model. But he was nothing if not persistent, because he was there every day, and I walked home every day. He usually stopped me and chatted for a few minutes, and finally he said, please just come to my studio and see what I'm doing. And I agreed to do that. We went through this passageway into this enormous warehouse where the full-size ex nihilo was in clay, and he had it raised so he could get the right perspective while he was working on it for the cathedral. So it was very impressive, and I took one look at that and I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's for real, you know, and said, yes, I would model. I think my thought was more, this wasn't just a way to meet women, to be honest about it. Ultimately, I guess it was.
We became good friends, and eventually she broke up with him after a year or two, whatever it was, and we had laid the groundwork in friendship for the relationship to develop into something more special. She is the one on the right-hand side on the bottom, the one that's sort of half asleep. The reason I was so intrigued with the idea of the creation theme was not because of its historical significance. It's sort of an ancient biblical, the book of Genesis sort of text, but it dealt with something that had a tremendous immediacy to modern life and to being alive for all humans everywhere. It dealt with how we are part of the creation itself, not only a part of the ongoing creation that began with the beginning, but that same process is at work in our lives as we unfold and as civilization and society unfolds and continues to become something that is a part of the divine.
Started working at the cathedral first as really a clerical job, and he became fascinated by the Italian stone carvers who were there working on the cathedral. And when this competition came along, he had learned to sculpt a bit, and he obviously had this amazing ability to just draw figures out of stone. It's like he was pulling them out like a fish. And he started reading the Bible for the content, Genesis, and so on. And as a result of that, this was a self-conversion. He became devout, and he wanted art to have something divine about it.
Rick is very aware of the tradition. He wants to reconnect, not just in a sense of style, but in the sense that Bernini, who he idolized, Bernini worked for a higher purpose. Not working just for art's sake. He's working for a higher purpose, to serve God, to serve his nation, to serve civilization. Rick never put his personal interests above the inspiration that drove him. He's always motivated by a higher purpose. The Renaissance is full of artists working at the same time, testing one another, inspiring one another. There's the famous story about Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo working in Florence at the Palazzo Vecchio at the same time, separated by 3 generations in age, communicating with one another, challenging one another. Rick is absolutely alone. He is shunned, he is attacked, and he's a hero. He did this.
The fundamental nature of the cathedral work was built around the idea of the relationship of form and nothingness, being and nothingness. The figures emerge from a void. The title of the central templum is ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. So I was always very intrigued with that philosophically. And at some point along the way, around 1975 or 76, someone asked me if I would be interested in doing a sculpture of a figure that was then a bronze, perhaps, I don't remember, that was then embedded in a block of lucite. And I started thinking about the idea, and I thought, well, what would happen if you embedded just a block of lucite in lucite? Well, it would disappear. But if you airbrush certain parts of it so that you could get it to appear and disappear at will, you could get some very, very interesting visual effects.
Rick said, this has been a dream of mine, to somehow take this medium that didn't exist for sculptors of earlier centuries, and you know, I'd like to sculpt with light, because light comes through the work and becomes a part of it. And so he showed me this. He said it's very difficult to do. It was actually a little figure embedded inside this block, but he said, I'd love to develop this process.
But no one did anything that was what I would call irregular castings or figurative work. It's all been essentially abstract works that were constructed of geometric shapes, spheres, triangles, blocks, and so on, that were assembled sometimes into very, very striking, brilliant assemblages. But no figurative artist had ever dealt with it, and there's a good reason, is that it was very difficult 15 years ago to cast a free form in lucite, because it took a flexible mold. And there was no known mold material at that time that could do that without either being attacked by the monomer or having a chemical effect on the monomer which would destroy it. I first got the idea of this, as I say, in 1976, and I thought I would just go to the hobby shop and get some acrylic monomer and make a little plaster mold or something and pour it. And in fact, it took about 6 or 7 years before we were even able to reliably make a cast. It took years more to develop the idea of the embedment technique. It's really a very simple concept. I do one sculpture, which is a cast in acrylic, and it is then suspended in a larger mold around which another pour of acrylic is poured, so that the sculpture is floating inside a larger acrylic block. Because you see that delicate airbrush surface, you can see what's inside, and by the degree or the manner or the opacity or the transparency of that airbrushing, I can make you see how much of it I want you to or not. So I can create juxtapose images, do all kinds of things. If I didn't airbrush it at all, then the sculpture inside would completely disappear. Well, for one thing, I knew that it would be strikingly beautiful and just visually terribly engaging, coming out of nothing, being born out of nothing and disappearing into nothingness.
You know, he had this wonderful smile and these, you know, twinkling eyes, and I could see the excitement as he talked about it. And so I knew that there was something here, and he wanted to work in a scale. He needed a little bit of relief from working on this large, you know, he worked in pretty much isolation, and so to go from the beginning to the end of a project, 13 years, you like that sense of completing something once in a while. So he wanted to be able to do something that would take this concept that he had and be able to develop a series of figures that would exploit this contemporary medium that had not been used before.
Frederick Hart statues in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial were controversial because Maya Lin's conception of this monument is so astonishingly powerful. And people were worried that Hart's sculpture in some ways violated this very powerful and uniquely postmodern, really, artistic statement. But it came out of a real need by the people that visited there. Maya Lin spoke of the dead. No one was speaking to the living.
He wanted to get me interested in the battle over the Vietnam memorial. And thereafter, I met him, but I was first just found it so unusual that there was a sculptor left who had any talent.
Well, there was the whole experience of the building the memorial was a reflection of the unfinished business of the Vietnam War, the intense, bitter debate over what it meant. And building a memorial is making a statement about what it meant. So there were a lot of people who had very, very intense feelings about what that statement should be. And I would say in a general way that people who saw the veterans as victims, who saw the whole thing as a senseless, meaningless tragedy, were those who were the most moved by the wall and most embraced it. And those who, particularly among veterans, who were proud of the fact that they had served their country. They felt as well as their fathers and forefathers had served, and were angry that there was no reference to that honor, to that duty, to that courage in the wall concept, only a listing of the dead. They were the ones who embraced the idea of adding a statue and adding a flag. And you can imagine the enormous, bitter confrontations that took place during that. And I was just sort of a little peapod on the sea of all those, that stormy sea. And of course I was vilified by those who were opposed to the statue because they were doing everything they could to prevent it from becoming a reality. So it was for me getting thrown into a lion's den of the likes I had never known before.
And I remember talking with Rick when he had been asked to do it about whether or not he was even going to accept the commission. One of the reasons he didn't want to do it was he didn't want to draw a mustache on somebody else's picture. And those are the words he used when we were talking about it.
When I went down in 1982 to listen to the hearings, it was the real beginning of the culture war. The veterans and conservative groups in general supported Rick Hart's work, and all the art establishment pretty much went nuts in their fight for Maya Lin's wall. Rick himself had no objection to Maya Lin's wall, but he thought that art should communicate to people, and that art had isolated itself too much from the public, and that Maya Lin's wall, however good it was part of that postmodern abstract thinking. And that's how I met him. I introduced myself to him. He was just a kid.
All of the contestants had to submit a plan in which there would be the names of all the dead, 57,000 people we're talking about. That was a condition of the memorial. And Rick's had at one end a fallen soldier with a comrade bending over him and looking up for help. And at the other end was a soldier starting to run towards the wounded soldier. At the time I said his was the only representational, realistic one. I never realized I was wrong. Maya Lin's wall was highly realistic. It was a tombstone.
The commission, after Rick finally did agree to accept it, really consumed him. And so he interviewed several thousand, he told me, vets. And I remember looking at the three faces, and we were talking about the face of the black man. And I said, oh my gosh. I said, Rick, that is so powerful. And he said, it is, but it's not right. And I said, why? He said, because it's angry. And I don't want it to be angry. I want it to be anguished. I came back about 2 months later, and I looked at the face. He got what he wanted.
I think that he was given a nearly impossible commission. How do you create a work which speaks immediately to the living in the presence of this great original artistic monument in a way that amplifies it and does not diminish it? And I think he succeeded.
Once I had done the statue and it had been put in place, everything, it was quiet because the statue was not what its critics said it was going to be. It was not a machoistic John Wayne thing that would have been inappropriate in that setting. It was something that really did end up being a part, very significant part of the healing process, because it was put to rest by that equipoise between the statue and the wall, that put to rest the conflict over the memorial.
I remember the unveiling, and I'll bet there were 100,000 vets there. When President Reagan spoke, it was one of the first times, I believe, where people began to respect and understand the horror of what the people who fought there and survived had gone through, and they began to look at it in a new way. As awesome as it is to stand and look at the Iwo Jima Memorial, Frederick Hart wanted the scale of the Vietnam soldiers to be where you could encounter it almost eyeball to eyeball. It's slightly larger than life size. They had wanted to put it high on a pedestal. He didn't want it that way.
There were some very, very important things to me that I wanted to convey, and I wanted to be in permanent conveyance, so to speak, to future generations about the experience of the Vietnam veteran. First off, the youth. These were 18 and 19-year-olds for the most part. The average KIA killed in action in Vietnam was 19 years old, whereas in the Second World War, I believe it was 25 or 26, and even older in the Civil War, because all of the kids who went into combat were just that. They were young draftees for the most part, or volunteers.
Was 18?
I was 19.
20.
17.
25.
I had my 18th birthday there.
March 17th, I had my 21st there. I even voted over there. I won't tell you for who.
I wanted to underscore their fragility in that they were usually in small units of way out for long periods of time in very, very terrifying situations where they were essentially under attack 24 hours a day. And they were very small groups who were very intensely interdependent and created intense bonds of love and mutual care.
It was 5 days before we evacuated him.
Yeah, I got shot and it was 5 days
When he
before
got shot.
We got originally medevac.
Took us 2 days to get up there.
We had men that died up there because we couldn't get them medevacs out. We lost over 2/3 of the company.
In 5 days.
If he killed one, then I asked him, I said, is everything all right? Because it was so dark you can't see.
They were going to write us off and let us die up there. It's a true story.
Yeah. I never thought I'd get out of there alive. He's Army up there.
Went up there with 3 corpsmen, come back with 1.
I'm the only survivor. Still haunts me today. It's still rough.
He disobeyed orders. He said he's going to go get them.
He says, I'm going to get those
He's going
guys.
to go get those guys.
We walked off of the hill with 38,
38?
and out of the 38, we had 17 walking wounded.
Yeah.
So when we got to the bottom of the hill and it was safe to evacuate them, we evacuated those 17 men.
But we had guys dying to say, to drag dead people back.
Right.
That was really something. So when the Marines say they take care of their people, that's exactly
We
what
didn't
they
leave
did up
anybody
there.
behind.
Yeah, nobody was left behind.
I wanted to portray that shadow of mortality that crosses their faces through their experience of that combat situation, that 1,000-yard stare, that terrible nihilistic wound that was put upon them One thing that was said that always touched me was one Marine wrote me and said he had the sense that they were looking for their own names on the wall.
It's something of wonder, a beauty, real great for the people that served there.
He got it right.
Oh, he got it right. That's very good.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
He did it right. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Contemporary art, whether it's painting or sculpture, by that I mean prestigious contemporary art, is theory-driven. And the artworks, without the theory to go with them, fall absolutely flat.
I think we need a reunion of art and craft. So much of what we call art today doesn't even pretend to reflect any real craftsmanship. And the great ages of art, all of the art has been, whether it's in bronze or in stone or a painting or mosaics or whatever, have been supremely crafted. So those things need to be respected again. We need to principally to reunite the art world with the public, and bring the public back into the weave of art, and bring art back into the weave of the public.
In the New York Times magazine, full color story by Tom Wolfe, entitled "The Artist the Art World Couldn't See." And I guess they had asked a number of prominent writers to write in the year 2000 about people who had had a significant impact on the culture who had passed away in the prior year when Rick died in 1999. But I'm not quite sure what it says about the fact that you have an immense talent like Frederick Hart, and there was so little attention paid to the actual work he created. There was attention paid to controversy around the work, based more on the figurative nature of his work. It wasn't that the work was disdained; it was that it was ignored.
And he said, "Have you seen my work at the cathedral?" And this is approaching 1990. I not only had never seen it, I never heard of it. It's finished. I had never heard of it.
Look, if somebody's nephew wants to go and move to some farm upstate and make chev the way it was made by the real artisanal cheesemakers and do everything exactly the way the old master cheesemakers did it, and you know, anybody would, at a cocktail party, they would say, "Oh, that's so marvelous, that's so wonderful." But then somebody's nephew decides they want to do classical, traditional Western painting. And it's like a family embarrassment.
People not only are not particularly interested in art in this period in society, they become actively hostile to it. In that there are portions of society who are truly campaigning, for example, to end the funding of NEA. And the art world brought this upon itself, in my view, because it has lost touch with the common man.
After the Second World War, it became harder and harder to find something new to say. But one of the things that today is a big genre is what's called de-skilled art. The supposition is that the artist had all these skills, but in order not to be false, he's gotten rid of these skills. And if you can come up with sort of crude, that's slightly cruder than what a talented baby would make, then you've de-skilled yourself, which is good, because you're not false anymore.
And I know that there's a large body of us who now believe that we're entering a whole new cycle of history, and that the whole modern academy, the whole modern establishment has played itself out. It's just a great historical cycle that is over.
In 2004, I received a call, absolutely out of the blue, that Rick had been awarded the Medal of Arts. And I had no idea that his name had been put forward. So it was a wonderful surprise. I went to the White House, Bob Chase and his wife Moya and my 2 sons.
The National Medal of Arts is the highest award the United States of America gives to artists and arts patrons. It was created in the 1980s under President Reagan, and it has been continued annually under all subsequent presidents. And you know, it was the first time in the history of the United States that the American government created a mechanism by which they could officially honor living artists. Now that's the irony with Frederick Hart, is that because he died at such an early age, he was never given the medal while he was living. And that's what led to the discussion about, you know, whether we should make an exception in his case.
He had applied to the NEA for a grant to help him when he received the commission for the cathedral and was turned down. So I think he would have taken some delicious delight in having received the Medal of Arts from National Endowment of the Arts, having been turned down.
If anybody doubts the integrity of Frederick Hart, the whole lawsuit around The Devil's Advocate.
He considered this work to be his masterpiece, and it was something sacred. It was about the creation of life. And here his masterwork was being demonized. And these figures even evolved, you know, into a sexual orgy. And he was so outraged. First of all, he was a passionate advocate for artist rights.
Hart took on a major entertainment conglomerate for essentially plagiarism and sort of libelous plagiarism. He sued them and he didn't ask for money. You know, he asked for his artistic integrity.
That's the difference between Rick Hart and a lot of other people. I mean, he didn't hold back. He went right for it.
I think he was happy with his career. I know he had other dreams and aspirations for his work and what he was able to achieve, but he didn't waste time being bitter. I mean, he was too looking into the future and his next idea.
I think if Rick were alive in 2009, he would be very happy to see that the community of people working in traditional mediums is growing in size, in strength, in sophistication. There are ateliers springing up all over New York, Florence, the rest of the world that are producing young painters of exceptional quality. And I'm sure the same thing is true in sculpture. So I think the world has changed enormously in the last 10 years. And I think Rick would find that he has a much larger community of fellow artists to talk to, and a much larger community of younger artists who would be following in his footsteps.
In my relation to Rick Hart, I certainly recognize, I see him as having needed to be a bolder and more willing to operate independently from the approbation of the culture than I did, and I felt like it was hard enough for me.
I get a lot of people who come in, they want to show me their artwork. The first thing I question them about is, could you paint a portrait if you needed to? And many of them, a lot of them actually more now, 17 years after I opened the gallery, say yes now than did 17 years ago.
In the last 15 or so years, things have gotten an awful lot. The world has become more friendly to artists like myself who are trying to make art in the classical tradition. The value of art doesn't necessarily derive from its relationship to any progressive arc, and that things can be excellent and beautiful because they're excellent and beautiful.
We have to revere the things about the past that are worth revering, and use them to move ahead. But the notion of using elements from the past is very much there for my students. So it's kind of interesting because the younger generation, as it's growing up, is in some sense politically not at all conservative, but artistically much more so than I think they were a generation ago.
How do we reconnect broader humanity with the power of art? And how do we take the energy of modernism, maintain it without being imprisoned in the conventions of modernism? And finally, how do we reconnect the energy of modernism and humanity with the proven power of traditional art? So what I think Hart was trying to do, and I think you see it in his best work, is to marry modernism with romanticism in a way which spoke to a broad mixed audience. And that is a noble endeavor.
I remember the person, but as more and more distance occurs between he being alive, I'm starting to think of him more as a historical figure. It's 10 years. Eventually, people will only remember him the way they remember Ghiberti or Leonardo, but he will be just as important.
I was recently in Sicily and in Palermo over the pediment of the Teatro Massimo. The English translation of the inscription is, art renews the people and reveals their identity. And when the guide translated that, I thought, you know, that's what Rick wanted art to be, and what it should be. And I think that's what he would be trying to do in 2009, to have art renew the people and to reveal our identity.
If I were asked how I wanted to best be remembered, I would like it to say in my most secret sort of desires to say that Hart was a singular and major force in creating a new historical development in the way that art was a part of society.
Rick comes to Washington in 1961, or at the tail end of 1960. John Kennedy is president. John Kennedy, on the inauguration day, and I usually like to start my stories about Rick with John Kennedy, and I'll make it very brief. John Kennedy on inauguration day and invited the poet laureate, Robert Frost, to create an original poem in honor of the event. And Robert Frost got up on that cold, wintry day. He was 87 years old, huge mane of white hair, like an old lion. And very cold day, but John Kennedy wasn't wearing a coat, he wasn't wearing a hat. And Robert Frost was blinded by the bright afternoon sun on the white paper where his poem was written. And John Kennedy got up and tried to help him adjust the papers. Maybe he can see what's going on. He can read his poem. And Frost brushed him aside. And he recited from memory one of his famous poems, "This land was our land before," and so forth. 10 years later, I'm in a secondhand bookstore and found the original program still sealed for the inauguration day. And in the back of that book is the poem that Robert Frost wrote. And it was called A New Augustan Age. A new Augustan age, golden age of poetry and power, of which this noonday is the beginning hour. He saw a new age, this old poet, the brilliant poem, never read, never heard, unknown. Now it's a little more known. He was talking about a new age. He was referring to the Emperor Augustus, who brought in a whole new age to Rome and brought it its glory, changed its architecture, brought in its great poets, commissioned poetry and architecture, brought a city of bricks that was a city of bricks and mud into a city of classical marble. That's what Robert Frost saw in John Kennedy. John Kennedy is assassinated. The darkness falls over this land, and I think it never fully recovered. Rick saw the same thing that Robert Frost saw, a new golden age. He worked in the darkness. Where he got that internal strength from is a story in itself.
Well, art is like armies. People have to get out and march and do it. They just don't flow into, into Waterloo or or Troy. These are events of will and determination based on convictions about the way things are and the way things should be. And I know that there's a large body of us who now believe that we're entering a whole new cycle of history, and that the whole modern academy, the whole modern establishment has played itself out. It's just a great historical cycle that is over. I think we have to have a reunion between high art and low art, in that now we have what you would call low art, which is rock and roll or any of these kinds of films, which is very vital. And people are very popularly involved. It's popular. People are involved in it. It reflects their lives. But it is often not crafted with the same finesse, with the same standards, with the same sense of striving that you would attribute to high art. But high art is out of touch, so to speak, with the people. So these things have to be brought back together again. I think we need a reunion of art and craft. So much of what we call art today doesn't even pretend to reflect any real craftsmanship. And the great ages of art, all of the art has been, whether it's in bronze or in stone or a painting or mosaics or whatever, have been supremely crafted. So those things need to be respected again. We need to principally to reunite the art world with the public, bring the public back into the weave of art, and bring art back into the weave of the public. And that what has to be done now is to go both forward and backward at the same time, to look back into history without feeling ashamed of that, because that's really been the thing that has inspired more art movements than not, whether it's the Renaissance or Georgian period or neoclassical or whatever, is that you draw from the successes of the past to create successes in the future. And I think there's a great momentum that's building now to refresh art again by drawing upon things that are known to be successful in the past, and also things that are proven to be of vital interest to people, of drawing people back into the fabric of art, rather than being in this sorry state that we tend to be in right now, where people not only are not particularly interested in art in this period in society, they become actively hostile to it. In that there are portions of society who are truly campaigning, for example, to end the funding of NEA. And the art world brought this upon itself, in my view, because it has lost touch with the common man.
I was at the cathedral yesterday because we were finalizing plans for my younger son, Xander's wedding in October. and we have gotten special permission from the cathedral. This has never been done, to have a wedding outside on the steps of the cathedral under ex nihilo. And it was very important to me to bring Rick into this moment in Xander's life. It was gratifying to realize how important it was to Xander and his fiancée, Rebecca, to have Rick's presence there and the spirit of the work itself, of creating this new life together and having the creation sculpture as part of that ceremony it has deep meaning for our family.
Well, I do think that some aspects of 20th century culture tend, to support the notion of abstract artists as the rebels. Because if you think of the 30s, whether you were in Nazi Germany or New Deal America or Soviet Russia, there was sort of an official realist aesthetic. It's called Soviet realism, in Russia. It was basically official Nazi art in Germany, and it was the WPA in the United States. Some wonderful stuff got done in the United States. I mean, some of the public sculpture that's done in Washington, in the 30s is magnificent stuff. Or if you go back into the 20s with sculptors like Paul Manship, I mean, these are distinguished sculptures. But I think it became associated with a kind of totalitarian, official, leveling view of art. It's like the bad post office mural. It's charming because it's a period piece, but on the other hand, it doesn't tend to be great art. And so I know, if you read the manifestos of modernism, in many ways, these artists were defining themselves as not bourgeois, as not official, as not part of this collective, but as individual sensibility. That does wonderful things for some artists because they could, whatever myth an artist has that they can take and work with, they can make something of it if they have enough genius. I don't think it's a particularly good universal theory of art.
Just about the time that I was finishing the tympanum, which was the sort of the heart of all of the other work, even though I had several years more work to do, I started to wonder, well, now what's going to be next for me? What possibly could rival this in importance or significance or public impact? And I thought, God, my life is over. What could come along that could possibly be as significant as this? And I started toying with the idea of doing a Vietnam's memorial, because at that time it was just so contradictory. It was just such a wild idea to memorialize what was essentially a defeat and a tragedy and so meaningless in such a scale. And I was intrigued with the idea, and then along came a letter to the editor by somebody named Jan Scruggs, who was a veteran and had $144 that it was the start of his fund to create a Vietnam memorial. This was around '79, I guess. And I called him up, just looked him up on the phone, called him up, got to know him, and up until that time I really had not known any Vietnam veterans. No one I knew had been in Vietnam, and I didn't know anybody in Vietnam. Most of my peers were protesters. So these were a whole new breed of cat to me. I was just astounded as I got to know them to really understand what their experience was all about. Because I was really, at that point in my life, my interest in Vietnam was on a big, colossal, sort of philosophical level. I saw Vietnam as a kind of a modern existentialist version of Greek tragedy. So getting to know Vietnam veterans was just a colossal revelation to me. And to understand the severity of their experience and the enormity of the sacrifice that they made voluntarily, and then the terrible wound that was theirs when they came home to find themselves, if not actively abused, forced to be ashamed of their experience. And I was deeply, deeply moved. And the more I got involved with them and with the project, the more I cast out a lot of these philosophical pretensions and became just passionately involved with the veterans' case, the veterans' cause themselves as human beings.
Can you tell us a little bit about how when you received the commission after the Maya Lin had received her wall commission, there was a lot of controversy on that. Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of how you received your exact commission?
Well, there was the whole experience of building the memorial was a reflection of the unfinished business of the Vietnam War, the intense, bitter debate over what it meant. And building a memorial is making a statement, a final statement about what it meant. So there were a lot of people who had very, very intense feelings about what that statement should be. And I would say in a general way that people who saw the veterans as victims, who saw the whole thing as a senseless, meaningless tragedy, were those who were the most moved by the wall and most embraced it. And those who, particularly among veterans, who were proud of the fact that they had served their country, they felt as well as their fathers and forefathers had served, and were angry that there was no reference to that honor, to that duty, to that courage in the wall concept, only a listing of the dead. They were the ones who embraced the idea of adding a statue and adding a flag. And you can imagine the enormous, bitter confrontations that took place during that. And I was just sort of a little peapod on the sea of all that stormy sea. And of course I was vilified by those who were opposed to the statue because they were doing everything they could to prevent it from becoming a reality. So it was for me getting thrown into a lion's den of the likes I had never known before. But once I had done the statue and it had been put in place, it was quiet because the statue was not what its critics said it was going to be. It was not a machoistic John Wayne thing that would have been inappropriate in that setting. It was something that really did end up being a very significant part of the healing process, because it was put to rest by that equipoise between the statue and the wall, put to rest the conflict over the memorial.
What were you trying to portray with the three soldiers in their expressions?
Yeah. There were some very, very important things to me that I wanted to convey, and I wanted to be in permanent conveyance, so to speak, to future generations about the experience of the Vietnam veteran. First off, the youth. These were 18 and 19-year-olds for the most part. The average KIA killed in action in Vietnam was 19 years old, whereas in the Second World War, I believe it was 25 or 26, and even older in the Civil War, because all of the kids who went into combat were just that. They were young draftees for the most part, or volunteers. Interestingly enough, 88% of those in combat in Vietnam volunteered, contradicting the current myth. But I wanted to underscore their youth. I wanted to underscore their fragility in that they were usually in small units of way out for long periods of time in very, very, terrifying situations where they were essentially under attack 24 hours a day. And they were very small groups who were very intensely interdependent and created intense bonds of love and mutual care. And I wanted to portray, and this is how I basically tied it in with the wall, I wanted to portray that shadow of mortality that crosses their faces through their experience of that combat situation, that 1,000-yard stare, that terrible nihilistic wound that was put upon them, and the enormity of that as a psychological burden. I wanted that very much in the way they looked at the wall, almost as if it were a vision for the war itself or their own experience. One thing that was said that always touched me was one Marine wrote me and said he had the sense that they were looking for their own names on the wall. And that, to me, meant that what I did succeeded in doing what I wanted it to do.
I know that when you were interviewing many of the veterans, you were able to incorporate into the sculpture things that only they would know about. Could you tell us some of those things that you did?
I'm not sure what do you mean by only they would know about?
Tags hidden, and there were things that you personally did from your own discoveries of them that you knew were part of their experience in Vietnam.
Right. The nice thing, in a sense, for this sculptor, that was that rather than being regularly uniformed types with helmets on that would have dehumanized them to a large extent in a sculpture, they were very individualistic in what they wore. They could, because they were out in the boonies and they were in small groups, they could get away with this kind of very irregular behavior. As a matter of fact, some of the old line officers didn't like the fact that they tended to be dressed in the gear that they chose, which is what they would do, and that they didn't have their headgear on, a lot of them. But it was very important to establish them as human beings, as you know, boys, and you have to see their faces. If I'd put them on, you know, in helmets, their faces would have been cast in shadow, and it would have been very easy to dismiss them as human beings, just to see them as sort of killer soldiers. So having the ability to do all of these little anecdotal things, whether it was the dog tags in the boot, or the grenade pin in the helmet band, or you know, a Marine wearing Army equipment, all these kind of things were very colorful ways that were true to history. And it gave me the opportunity to do something that was both picturesque, interesting to look at, and at the same time reveal them as human beings.
Your sculpture is probably one of the most recognized and talked about sculptures in the country. What do you personally feel it has done to resolve such an important issue in our country?
You mean the Vietnam conflict? Well, the sculpture and the wall don't, in a sense, belong together in stylistically at all. So it was a real trick to do something that was figurative, and yet keep it so that it didn't intrude upon or destroy the effect of the wall. And I did that by drawing the figures away from the wall and making them so that they didn't compete in scale in any sense. They're very, very small. They're only 7 feet tall. But I drew the whole thing together as a totality by having the figures relate to the wall. And having those two elements in that state, as I said, of counterbalance or equipoise, in a way which creates a totality, does that healing thing in a sense that it brings together those extreme elements which were bitterly opposed to them in a resolution. And that's why I think when the statue was put in and it was there and everybody could understand exactly what I was doing, the seas became quiet.
Frederick Turner said in the article about you that long after the names on the wall became names that simply were names, you know, after generations, they simply will be names the same way Civil War names are now just names to us, that your sculpture will maintain the freshness and the vitality of the impact of the moment. Do you want to comment on that?
Well,
Was that your intent?
I think that the emotionalism that occurs at the wall is due to the names, that it's so overwhelming, such a mass of names, and seeing it in the sequence that it is, in a chronological sequence as opposed to an alphabetical sequence, is really an ingenious way of of driving home the event. You can't dismiss it as easily. But I do think that perhaps when those names become like Civil War names, that the impact will be lessened. And I hope that the statuary will continue to carry the intensity of that experience in a way that people can understand, and will continue to give those names a life that they wouldn't have after all the people who knew them have gone. The ride was done because I love horses, and I do ride, and it was done as a sort of a dream image, and I used my own horse as the model. And sometime after, or while I was working on it, I discovered a lovely poem by Richard Wilbur entitled, interestingly enough, The Ride. Let me read it, just a couple of stanzas from that. I rode with magic ease at a quick, unstumbling trot through shattering vacancies on into what was not. How shall I now get back to the inn yard where he stands, burdened with every lack, and waken the stable hands, to give him, before I think, that there was no horse at all, some hay, some water to drink, and a blanket and a stall. That's all.